So I'm a bit overwhelmed listening to all these wonderful presentations and the very sophisticated use of theory. So I feel I have to begin by saying this is very new empirical research that I'm presenting today. Just to emphasize how new it is, we did the last interview yesterday, so we haven't fully analyzed the data yet. So this is more reflections. I don't have the theoretical analysis ready yet, so please bear that in mind. And the presentation is based on research I'm doing with my two colleagues, Maria and Alessia, whose names are there. So as you will be aware, there was a very damning report published just a couple of weeks ago by a cross-party committee of MPs condemning the Foreign Office in Britain for its serious systemic failures during the evacuation mission from Kabul airport in August 2021. According to that recent report, there was insufficient staff to manage the process, and many tens of thousands of emails requesting immediate assistance went completely unread. The report was also critical of the Prime Minister Boris Johnson for his lack of understanding of the complex and rapidly unfolding situation in Afghanistan, as he informed Parliament only weeks earlier that there was no military path to victory for the Taliban. The Foreign Office, the Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab, also came in for criticism for his apparent lack of interest in the evacuation process. I'm going to be showing these photographs. I'm sure they're very familiar to you because they got a lot of press attention at the time. So just a quick recap, the British government evacuated approximately 17,000 people. It's hard to get exact numbers in the summer of 2021 in what was called Operation Pitting. Approximately 5,000 of those were eligible for the Afghan Relocation and Assistance Policy, ARAP, a scheme aimed at providing relocation and assistance to people who had worked with or for the British government or the armed forces in Afghanistan. In addition to that, the new Afghan Citizen Resettlement Scheme promises to offer asylum to a further 20,000 Afghans over the next 3 years. Now, the British government extols its commitment to supporting Afghans, but in fact, Britain has actually taken far fewer Afghan refugees in recent years than other countries, including, for example, Switzerland and Belgium. Most of the estimated 2.6 million Afghan refugees, and in fact, it's going to be a much higher number now, are actually living in neighboring countries such as Pakistan and Iran. And as we know, the notorious Nationality and Borders Act in Britain, which has recently come onto the statute books, will further reduce pathways for refugees fleeing violence in Afghanistan and other countries. So the Home Office has provided resettlement through emergency bridging accommodation. I've done a lot of research with people who are in the bridging hotels. I don't have time to talk about that now, but if anybody is interested afterwards, I'd be quite happy to talk about the experience of interviewing people in those hotels in London. So just to go back to the actual evacuation process. In our research, we've been listening to harrowing stories, and going back to what Sylvia said a moment ago, this is really visceral, this is very powerful, it's very physical. And we're interviewing people who were right there at the center of the evacuation process. And they talked about their experiences, and as many of them have emphasized to us, it was many, many times worse than what we saw on our television screens. And people have described the crowds, the conditions, the fear, and the insecurity of the entire process. We've heard many stories amongst our participants of people who tried to get to the airport on several occasions, who were unable to get through, or whose relatives had to go back because of the threat to life, of the crush and the conditions of waiting, particularly to be processed outside the infamous Barron's Hotel in Kabul, where conditions were absolutely atrocious. For example, people were queuing outside the hotel for 2 days and 2 nights without food or water. One of our participants described British soldiers throwing bottles of water into the crowd, and he said that there were not enough, and that only the strongest and the tallest could catch these bottles of water as they went flying through the air, and most people didn't get any water, not to mind food. He also emphasized the lack of facilities. For example, there were no toilets and people were in the queue for 2 days and 2 nights. So really degrading, inhuman conditions and treatment. Many of our participants were in the queues with young children, And they talked about the heat, the flies, the lack of food, the lack of water and toilet facilities, and how absolutely terrifying and distressing it was, especially for young children, to be in those conditions. Moreover, several participants spoke about the gunfire. So there were almost kind of fights breaking out between the Taliban and the armed forces, and the participants were caught in the crossfire with bullets flying. People reported actually seeing people in the queue around them being shot. Now, as well as the appalling conditions, people also talked about the absolute chaos of the process itself. And this photograph is very powerful. Sorry, it's a bit grainy. I don't know if you can see it, but it shows people standing in what is actually a filthy canal, and they're holding up their emails, their pieces of paper, they're holding up their phones to the soldiers to try to get their attention, to try to get their documents accepted so they can then get safe passage through to the airport. And many of our participants were precisely in those canals, sometimes for hours on end. One of our participants was stuck in one of those canals from 7 p.m. until 8 a.m., literally standing there shouting, trying to get the attention of a soldier who would then take them out of the queue and process their application forms. And some participants said that the British authorities were very reluctant to accept some of these documents at face value because they said that there were quite a lot of faked emails, and it was very hard to verify the veracity of people's documentation. One of our participants, a young girl only in her early 20s, said that she was waiting in the canal for 4 hours, just shouting, trying to get somebody to hear her. And in the end, 2 female soldiers kind of took pity on her, really, listened to what she was saying, then pulled her out, checked her emails, and eventually she was processed and sent forward into the queue. But we heard of many others who had stories where they just weren't accepted and they weren't able to get through. Now, there was overall general agreement about the whole precarity of this process. Simply having your documents, simply having had this relationship where you were employed, for example, by the British Army, was absolutely no guarantee that you would get processed and that you would get out on time. Moreover, some of our key informants said that this emphasis on a connection with the British government or the British Army, which was used to kind of process people's eligibility, that doesn't map onto any international instruments that determine who should actually get protection. So it was quite a spurious connection to assess people's rights to be removed. When thank
Louise.
you, thanks, John. When Malala finally managed to get into the airport, she then had to draw on her connections. She had to very quickly make phone calls to influential British people, including a well-known journalist, who were then able to kind of negotiate her way through the labyrinth which faced her inside the Baron Hotel. And then eventually somebody from the British Embassy was able to get through on the phone and approve her eligibility to go through. But this same participant described other people, including an Afghan police woman who was rejected and was told that no, actually, she wasn't eligible, even though it was actually deemed that she was in a particularly vulnerable position from the Taliban. And then, of course, the participants described what it was like when they finally got into the planes. And I mean, under no health and safety conditions can you imagine people being packed into an airplane like this. But people described their overwhelming sense of relief when they finally got into the plane, but also coupled with often a sense of guilt that they got out, whereas many tens of thousands of others did not. So just to bring it to a conclusion, and as I said, this is very new data. It's not theorized. We're just beginning to process our findings. But what really shines through is the absolute chaos of the process, the complete lack of preparation on the part of the authorities, the lack of basic provisions such as water and toilets for people who were queuing for days on end. And the problem really seemed to be that because the troops had been evacuated quite quickly, there was very little personnel on the ground to actually guarantee the safety and to process the applications of those who were trying to get out under very, very hurried conditions at Kabul airport. Now, like the Syrian crisis, and we can draw parallels with the Syrian crisis only 7 years earlier, and the current Ukrainian crisis, the issue here seems to be a lack of any lessons learned. The British authorities, the Foreign Office, the Home Office, they never seem to learn any lessons from these past unprecedented, and I'm putting unprecedented in quotes, there's never any learning. Every new crisis is treated as precisely a new crisis. The issue as well here, and I'm a migration scholar, so I've been researching migration for the last 20 years. The overriding issue here seems to be the hostile environment is the key backdrop against which all of these policies are enacted. And as we know, the hostile environment is a very strong ideological position rather than an evidence-based policy or practice. It means that the emphasis from the Home Office in particular is in keeping people out, rather than putting any actual practical policies and practices in place that would enable them to deal with these recurring unprecedented incidents. We can be sure that there will be more crises, that there will be more emergencies whereby we have refugees who need to be given safe passage at very short notice. If no lessons are learned, if the emphasis continues to be on creating a hostile environment and not letting anybody in, then we are never going to learn any lessons, and we're going to see these kinds of situations unfold again and again in the future. Thank you very much.